Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Silvinas, for the invitation to come and speak here at your event. On the Free Market Roadshow last year, I talked pretty much about the euro and how unviable it is, if not in the short term, then in the medium to long term. I'm going to talk actually less about Europe today. I'm going to talk more about Asia and what lessons Asia might have for Europe that relate to the big questions we have this morning. And that relates very much to a personal story. I'm, as my name might suggest, I'm actually half Asian. The other half is British, which you can probably guess. But the half you can't guess is from Sri Lanka. So, I'm half British, half Sri Lankan, half European, half Asian, if you count Britain as part of Europe, that is, and a minority all round. On my British side, I'm from Wales, which I don't usually advertise, and on my Sri Lankan side, I'm from the Muslim minority. Now, for a long time, I lived and worked in London. I taught at the London School of Economics. I helped to set up a think tank in Brussels. But 2 years ago, I left Europe for Asia, and I live and work now in Singapore. So Singapore and Asia is my home, and I visit Europe from time to time. So I look at Europe quite differently now to the way I looked at it when I lived in London and also worked part-time in Brussels. So I'd like to share some of those observations with you. In terms of what I see of Europe from my vantage point in Singapore, the picture does not look good. In general terms, I think many of the symptoms of the Eurosclerosis of the 1970s are back in full force. So the macroeconomics of Europe look really pretty bad in terms of public as well as private debt. There is no agenda at the Europe-wide level of serious structural reform, and many, possibly most of the economies in Europe look pretty anemic on most counts one can think of. That problem is compounded by the way European integration is going, arguably in quite a wrong direction, in the direction of further bureaucratic centralization and discretionary power. And much of that is associated with an attempt to keep the euro alive as it is, which is probably unviable beyond the short term. These political and economic fault lines have social and cultural consequences, as one sees across the European continent. And what strikes me in particular, living in a society like Singapore, is the lack of a work ethic and an education ethic in much of Europe, which is particularly dispiriting when one sees it among the young. Now, that's a general gloomy picture, but of course there are exceptions. Germany is a partial exception. I'm not sure for how long. Switzerland is certainly an exception. Some of the Nordic countries are exceptions. And indeed, you here in the Baltics, given what you had to go through 20 years ago or more, and the way you've had to adjust to successive crises, arguably are among the more successful exceptions in the wider Europe. Let me now turn to Asia and what lessons I think Asia might have for the European condition and the European prospect. And what I'm going to do is draw on first a course I teach in Singapore at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, which is called Asia in the World Economy. The link is up there. And there's an associated presentation, an op-ed, as well as a paper that's coming out with the Cato Institute and with my think tank in Brussels. So these are just some highlights from what I've just mentioned. And I'll try and draw lessons for Europe from all that. And I'm just going to show you some very simple slides, nothing at all elaborate. To begin with, Asia is a Greek construct. There is no such thing as Asia. Asia is much more diverse, even compared with Europe. In Alexander the Great's imagination, Asia was everything roughly east of Greece, and Africa was everything south. Asia has one component, West Asia, some of which is very poor, some of which is oil-rich. It has a component in the north, which is mainly steppe. The more interesting parts of Asia are in the east and south, and that's globalizing Asia. But even East and South Asia are in themselves very, very diverse, all the way from high-income economies stuck in the northeast, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, plus the city-states of Hong Kong and Singapore, to successful middle-income economies like Malaysia and Thailand, all the way through to poor South Asia and poorer parts of Indochina. That gives you a flavor of the diversity. But trying to generalize from all that, I think there is one general story about what has been happening in globalizing Asia over the last few decades that hasn't been told enough, and that I think has very powerful lessons for the rest of the world. And that story is really one of a dramatic expansion of economic freedom, which has created all sorts of interesting consequences. Now, what's most visible in that story, particularly since the global economic crisis, is what people call a shift to the east. So, just to take you through a few slides here, the West had a financial crisis, which the West is still suffering from, and that's a medium-term condition in terms of low growth, high unemployment, and so on. But emerging markets, particularly in Asia, went into the global financial crisis with pretty healthy public and private finances, relatively low levels of debt in the main. So they came out of it much more quickly. As this chart from the IMF shows, if you look at the emerging and developing economies, budget deficits are much lower than they are in the advanced economies. Even more telling, levels of public debt, which on average are about 100% or above in the advanced economies, and about 120% in the G20. The equivalent in emerging markets is about 30%. So that tells you much of the essential story. Much healthier public finances in developing Asia in particular. This is also telling. If we look at the growth numbers since the crisis, and you take the latest forecast for this year, Europe is set to have flat growth again, zero growth or even less. The United States about 2%, Japan 1.5%, but China 8%, India 6%, developing Asia about 7% this year, which is roughly similar to what's been happening in the past few years. Now, if you add that up, from the time of the crisis to today, what we've seen is that the advanced economies have grown by about 2% since the crisis. China has grown by 60%, 6-0. India by above 40%, developing Asia by about 50%. Now, what that tells us is that what's actually been happening for some time, since the opening up of Asia after the Second World War, has been accelerating. So this short-term divergence of economic performance is accelerating the longer-run convergence of emerging markets and of Asia in particular with the West. There's still quite some way to go, but the gap has narrowed considerably. Now, that's roughly the story that many economists will tell you in a nutshell, but what I want to do is really go beyond that and try and tease out what I think is the essential story. And that is, as I said a moment ago, of this dramatic expansion of economic freedom across the Asian continent, very much in the sense that Adam Smith described it, the expansion of natural liberty. and animal spirits have been unleashed. What we've seen is a vast continental awakening. Technology has something to do with it, but the big driver has been very much the liberalization of markets, both within countries and between countries, globalization as it were. And I think Europe has big lessons to learn from that Asian story. The other side of the coin is that there is huge unfinished business across Asia because markets remain repressed, indeed more repressed than they are in the West. That's the broad canvas. Let me try and break that down now. And what I want to do is extract 5 big lessons from the Asian story, which are of relevance to Asia, but I think other parts of the world as well. And that's a combination of negative and positive lessons. The first lesson is a negative one. Asia was held back for millennia, and indeed in the 20th century, because rulers and ruling elites repressed their populations in all kinds of ways. And the most egregious examples of that were Mao in China, India's license Raj, and for example, the period of rule by President Sukarno in Indonesia up until the mid-1960s. The good thing is that we haven't seen egregious examples like that, not on a big scale, more recently in Asia. So those are clearly examples to avoid of repressing people and markets. The second lesson is that Asia, more recently, many countries in Asia, have actually done better at copying the policies and the institutions that made the West successful over centuries and indeed a millennium. So for most of the past millennium, the story has very much been one of Western success, but of the failure of places outside the West. What made the West successful? Well, it was a combination of institutions friendly to the market, property rights, contracts, actually favoring the entrepreneur in all sorts of ways, plus opening up to the outside world through international trade in particular. And that mixture of trade and institutions allowed the West to race ahead of other parts of the world, particularly after the Industrial Revolution. Asian countries have, for the most part, been much more successful at copying those lessons more recently. The third lesson is, I think, perhaps the most interesting one. There have been previous golden ages of Asian commerce that have a parallel with the European miracle of the medieval era. That's to say, competition between cities and micro-regions for people, for talent, for goods and services. There was a period before Western colonization when Indian Ocean commerce was dominated by little city-states along coastlines that were religiously tolerant, that had low taxes, that had low tariffs, that encouraged traders, including lots of foreign traders, who traded across seas and oceans that were largely free, mare liberum in Grotius's sense. The modern successors to that kind of networks are very much cities led by Hong Kong and Singapore. And I think there is a big lesson for Europe and other parts of the world from what's going on in terms of how cities, particularly cities on coastlines, are developing and building networks with each other and expanding economic freedom at the same time. And that's happening very significantly across East and South Asia. And I will end with the Hong Kong and Singapore story a little later. The fourth lesson I have is very much about getting the basics right in inverted commas. Now, you will hear from many commentators that the reason why some countries in Asia, like Japan and Korea yesterday, or China today, why they're successful, is because they have intelligent governments who pursue intelligent industrial policies. They know how to intervene in particular sectors here and there. And we're much worse at doing that here in Europe or in the United States. There is no evidence to show that that has worked. There is plenty of evidence to show that this kind of industrial policy of selecting winners and picking national champions has been spectacularly unsuccessful in different parts of Asia. And even in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, where they were allegedly successful, there is no hard evidence to show that they were. The reason why these miracle economies became miraculous is because they got the basics right. And there is plenty of evidence to show that that's the case. They had prudent, and they continue to have prudent fiscal policies, conservative monetary policies, relatively low domestic distortions to markets, like price controls and subsidies, relatively flexible labor markets. They put in the hard infrastructure. They paid attention to education and skills, and not least and crucially, they opened up to international trade and to globalization. Those are getting the basics right. My final, fifth lesson is very much about globalization. Opening up to the world has been crucial to these economies, especially to small open economies, like the Baltic states here in Europe. And that's led to enormous success in terms of growth. About 1 billion people have been taken out of poverty, of extreme poverty, in the last 2 decades, as the most recent figures from the World Bank tell us. Nearly all that number come from globalizing Asia. 2/3 of that number come from China, and very much for the reasons that I've just gone through. It's not been because of successful social engineering from above. It's been very much about liberalization that's created the space for economic freedom to flourish and for animal spirits to be let loose. Those, I think, are the really big lessons from the Asian story for the rest of the world. There are still huge challenges in most countries in Asia. So if we look at financial markets, if we look at policies towards trade and foreign investment, if we look at energy markets, we still see that in most countries in Asia, they're still more repressed, there are still more government controls than there are even in Europe. So there is still a long, long way to go. And if you look, for example, at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, you will see, quite strikingly, there are only 3 Asian countries in the top 10. There are, I think, about 5 or 6 in the top 20. But there aren't that many European countries in the top 10. About 2 or 3, I think. There may be a few more in the top 20. And there is wide diversity if you look across Asian countries. If you look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index that the Fraser Institute puts out, you see that there are only 2 Asian countries in the top 20, and that's Hong Kong and Singapore, which are, of course, exceptional. So that gives you an indication of what's still left to be done. Let me make some concluding points and finally tell you a little story about how things work in Hong Kong and Singapore in particular, and what lessons they might have for other parts of the world, particularly for small states, as well as cities that aspire to be global cities. Economic reform, in the sense of expanding economic freedom, has 3 main components. One is getting the basics right, which I mentioned earlier: macroeconomic stability, microeconomic reform to boost competition, opening up to international trade are the main ingredients. Then it gets a little bit more complicated in the sense of pursuing structural reforms that you can't undertake overnight, that are politically more sensitive, that are also administratively and technically more complex. So that involves getting rid of all kinds of red tape measures, improving the functioning of markets, and the third leg of reform, institutional reform, putting in more sophisticated market-supporting institutions to enable economies to function more competitively, improving property rights and contracts, the judiciary, public administration, regulatory agencies, and so on. those are the three main aspects of economic reform: getting the basics right, structural reform, and institutional reform. Now, the mix of the three obviously has to differ between countries as well as over time. Getting the basics right is something that poor economies that are engaged in catch-up growth have to do, but these are also economies that don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the capacity to engage in a whole lot of structural and institutional reforms at the beginning, at least. They have to get the basics right. And that's true of much of Asia still today, because Asia is still home to about 2/3 of the world's extreme poor, particularly in South Asia. But economies that are more advanced, that are middle-income economies or high-income economies, of which there are many in Asia, and which is the condition essentially in Europe and also in other parts of the West, they have to continue to get the basics right, but they have to undertake the more difficult structural and institutional reforms as well. So if you look across Europe, I think the lessons to learn are basically the following. Firstly, the condition now after the crisis is probably worse than it was before the crisis, and worse than it has been since the 1970s, in that at the EU level and in individual states, politicians, decision makers have forgotten how to get the basics right, starting with macroeconomic policy and the wild adventurism that we see with monetary policy and to some extent with fiscal policy as well. So getting the basics right is still important, even if you're a high-income or a middle-income economy. Secondly, when it comes to the more difficult structural institutional reforms, much of Europe, most of Europe, certainly at the EU level, is falling very short because there is no serious agenda for this kind of market-supporting, freedom-expanding reforms, as it were. There is, however, one advantage, I think, that the West has compared with many countries in Asia. When it gets to the more difficult reforms, authoritarian systems are probably not the answer. Catch-up growth is possible under authoritarian systems, as China has proved, as other countries in Asia have shown in recent decades. But when you want to do the more difficult reforms, you need a more decentralized political system with checks and balances, with more transparency, more accountability, to use the cliched words. And that is, warts and all, what liberal democracies have in the West, but what a lot of countries outside the West don't have. So those, I think, are some of the big lessons that I would draw. Mixed lessons, as you see, but the main lesson is very much of the ingredients behind this dramatic expansion of economic freedom and the success it's brought across Asia. And that's very much an Adam Smithian story rather than a story of social engineering through successful industrial policies. Let me end with just a few lessons from what I think are the two places on earth that come closest to resembling the ideal that Adam Smith painted in The Wealth of Nations, and indeed which Milton Friedman eulogized in Free to Choose, both the book and, of course, the TV version. And those are the city-states of Hong Kong and Singapore. Now, I don't want to oversimplify because they have their problems too, and they are not free market paradises. Nowhere on the world is like that. But they come closer than anywhere else. Both started out with nothing. They have no natural resources. If you look at their history and their present, what you'll see is that government does actually perform some important functions, including having a role in education and infrastructure and providing certain public services, but it's still under 20% of GDP. And these are wealthy economies with per capita income of about $40,000 plus a year, much wealthier than the European average. So government spending kept relatively low, mainly because they have deliberately avoided creating long-term entitlements for the middle class and the rich. They have a very basic safety net for the very poor, but it doesn't go much beyond that. That's one important lesson. Another is free trade. They have zero tariffs. Hong Kong and Singapore are fully open free ports, which is why, one major reason why so much trade comes in and out of both ports. They are fully open to foreign direct investment. They have rock-solid monetary policies. In other words, they've got the basics right, but they've gone beyond getting the basics right. For example, in Singapore, you can set up a business in about half a day, and you go to just one place to register your business. You have one-stop shops in Singapore rather than multiple approval procedures. I can give you many other stories about these places, but let me end with one very personal story. I'm very grateful to have moved from the UK to Singapore. I filed my last UK tax return a couple of months ago. It took me the whole weekend, and I had to give several £1,000s to the British taxpayer, to the British Tax Authority, for I hope the very last time, because I don't intend to move back. I filed my first Singapore tax return the same week, on the very last day of filing. It's 2 sheets of paper online. And the reason why it's 2 sheets of paper is because they have very few deductions. Compare this with Americans. Whether they're in the United States or working abroad, it doesn't matter, because they have to pay US taxes, who have to fill in labyrinthine tax returns. And I'm very grateful to Singapore because I ended up spending 10 minutes online filling in my tax return, and that included a couple of phone calls to the tax authority to clear up some questions. And less than 5% of the income I earned in Singapore is going to the Singapore government. What I earn outside Singapore is not taxed in Singapore, and it's perfectly legal. Those are close to golden conditions for the expansion of economic freedom. And it's not just something that benefits the tiny minority or a globalized elite, as it were, but it spreads the benefits around magnificently. And those, I think, are some of the best lessons to learn, particularly in a world where cities, through urbanization, are becoming ever more important, and might even come to a situation some decades hence when they rival countries. So if you think of Hong Kong and Singapore and places like that as cities connected to others across oceans, across skies, there are, I think, very powerful lessons to learn and very transplantable lessons to learn at that. Thank you.